London was a city built to burn. By the summer of 1666, the capital of England had become one of the busiest commercial centres in the world. Money poured through its streets. Merchants crowded into its markets. Warehouses along the Thames overflowed with goods from across the globe. But beneath all that wealth was a terrifying weakness. London was packed with timber houses, narrow lanes, overhanging upper floors, and warehouses filled with highly flammable materials. The same crowded urban design that made the city rich had also turned it into a giant reservoir of fuel. And then came the summer. It was long, hot, and exceptionally dry. Moisture disappeared from the timber that formed the city's buildings. Streets baked beneath the sun. Firewood, thatch, and wooden structures became dangerously dry. London was no longer simply vulnerable to fire. It was waiting for one. And in the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, that spark finally came. The Great Fire of London would eventually destroy more than 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and much of the city's commercial heart. But the disaster was not simply the result of bad luck. It was the result of a city that had been allowed to become dangerously combustible. This is the story of how London caught fire, and why, once the flames began, almost nothing could stop them. The fire began near Pudding Lane, in the bakery of Thomas Fariner. For centuries, the traditional story placed the first flames somewhere inside the bakery itself, but later historical research has offered a more precise explanation. By comparing a surviving 17th-century property plan with contemporary maps, historians have identified a small rear yard, roughly 13 yards behind the bakery, as the likely point of origin. That detail matters. Because the yard contained something far more dangerous than an ordinary pile of firewood, it contained bavins. These were tightly bound bundles of dry brushwood used as fuel for commercial baking. Designed to burn quickly and intensely, they were an ideal source of heat for an oven. But in the middle of a hot, dry summer, a large quantity of bavins stored in a confined wooden yard created something else entirely: a massive fuel load. All the city needed was an ignition source. That source appears to have been a stray ember, although the Fariner family later insisted that the bakery ovens had been extinguished before midnight. Somehow, a spark survived. It found its way into the dry fuel stored nearby. By the time Fariner's apprentice and family woke in the early hours of September 2nd, the situation had already become impossible to control. Smoke filled the building. The ground floor was burning. And the family had no effective firefighting equipment or enough manpower to contain the flames. Their only option was escape. They climbed through an upper-story window and crossed onto a neighboring roof. And with that, the last human barrier between a small fire and a major disaster disappeared. The burning fuel continued to generate heat. The flames reached beyond the property. And London was about to discover that its greatest strength, density, was also its greatest weakness. The fire did not spread through a city of isolated buildings. It spread through one enormous connected fuel system. Much of 17th-century London was built from timber, and one architectural feature made the situation even worse. It was called jettying. Because land in central London was expensive, builders tried to squeeze as much living space as possible onto small plots. The solution was to make each upper floor extend slightly farther over the street than the floor beneath it. The result was larger rooms. But it also brought neighbouring buildings dangerously close together. On some of London's narrowest streets, the upper floors of opposing houses almost touched. For a fire, this created a natural bridge. Flames did not need to cross an open street. Radiant heat could ignite timber across the gap. Burning debris could fall onto neighboring roofs, and once one building caught fire, the next one was often only moments away. The architecture itself was helping the flames move, and the walls were not much safer. Many houses relied on wattle and daub construction. A framework of woven wood was covered with a protective layer of clay, mud, and other materials. When properly maintained, this coating could provide a degree of fire resistance. But London was crowded. Buildings were old. Maintenance was inconsistent. In poorer districts, the protective daub had cracked, deteriorated, or fallen away entirely. The result was disastrous. The wooden framework beneath was left exposed. A wall that should have helped resist fire had become another source of fuel. Then there was the city's layout. London's streets were narrow, winding, and often extremely difficult to navigate. There were few open spaces that could act as natural fire breaks, and the firefighting technology of the time was primitive. Hand pumps could help with small fires, but against a rapidly expanding inferno, they were almost useless. The city had created 3 perfect conditions for catastrophe. The buildings provided the fuel, jettying provided the pathway, and the streets made intervention almost impossible. London was no longer a collection of buildings. It was becoming one enormous combustion system. Then the fire reached the Thames. This was where London's wealth was concentrated. The waterfront was lined with warehouses packed with goods brought in through the city's global trading network. Hay, paper, timber, tar, and countless other materials that could burn. As the fire approached, the intense heat began to transform these warehouses into traps. The flames did not always need to touch the fuel directly. Radiant heat could raise temperatures inside buildings until combustible materials suddenly ignited. This process, known as flashover, could turn an enclosed space into an inferno in moments. And when highly flammable materials such as tar were involved, the consequences were devastating. The fire accelerated. It moved deeper into the commercial heart of London. And soon, one of the most important symbols of England's economy was in its path: the Royal Exchange. This was the centre of London's commercial world. Merchants traded there. International goods changed hands there. Fortunes were made there. Its destruction represented far more than the loss of a single building. It was the destruction of a physical hub that connected merchants, financiers, and global trade. Inside and beneath the exchange were valuable commodities, including silks and large quantities of pepper associated with the East India Company. As the building burned, the heat was so intense that the surrounding streets filled with thick smoke. The city's commercial infrastructure was collapsing, and behind the burning markets were the people who controlled London's money. They now faced a desperate question: how much of their wealth could they save before the city itself disappeared? One of those men was Robert Vyner, a hugely wealthy goldsmith and banker to King Charles II. Vyner lived on Lombard Street, at the centre of London's financial district. When it became clear that the fire could not be stopped, the value of physical wealth suddenly changed. Money in a building was no longer safe. Records could burn, gold could be lost, jewels could disappear, and entire businesses could vanish in a single afternoon. Vyner managed to move valuable assets, including gold, jewels, and important financial records, away from the danger. But many others were not so fortunate. Merchants struggled through streets filled with people trying to escape the flames. Goods were abandoned. Businesses collapsed, and the financial centre of London was left exposed to the fire. But the city's destruction was not caused by fire alone. It was also caused by hesitation. London had a weapon against major urban fires: demolition. The basic principle was simple. If buildings were pulled down quickly enough, the fire would lose its fuel. A gap could be created. The flames could be stopped. But demolition required decisive action, and that action did not come soon enough. The Lord Mayor of London, Thomas Bloodworth, had the authority to order buildings demolished to create fire breaks. Yet early in the disaster, the response was slow. Property owners resisted the destruction of their buildings. Officials hesitated, and precious hours were lost. The fire was still relatively localized when decisive demolition might have contained it. Instead, the flames continued to spread. The political system that was supposed to protect London had failed at exactly the moment it was needed most. And then nature made the situation even worse. The wind changed everything. A powerful easterly wind pushed the flames across the city. It fed the fire with oxygen and carried burning embers far beyond the immediate front. At extreme temperatures, the blaze no longer behaved like an ordinary house fire. It behaved more like a wildfire moving through a dry landscape. The rising column of hot air carried burning fragments into the sky. These embers traveled over streets and landed on distant roofs. A building could catch fire without the main flames ever reaching it. Then another building. Then another. The fire began to leap across London. It was no longer moving in a single direction. It was creating new fires everywhere. The city was being attacked from multiple fronts at once. And the narrow streets that had once been the arteries of commerce became obstacles. People tried to escape. Merchants tried to save their possessions. Firefighters struggled to reach the flames. Carts blocked roads. Crowds filled the streets, and above them, burning debris continued to fall. London's entire system was collapsing. At this point, the crisis could no longer be handled by the local authorities alone. King Charles II was forced to intervene. The king had been criticized for his response to the previous year's plague, and his government had already faced enormous pressure. Now the capital itself was burning. Charles understood what the destruction of London would mean. This was not merely the loss of houses. It was the potential collapse of the kingdom's economic center. The king took a more active role. Military forces were deployed. Command posts were established, and the demolition of buildings was finally used on a much larger scale to create fire breaks. The strategy was brutal. Buildings had to be sacrificed to save the city. But it worked. After several days of destruction, the fire finally began to lose its momentum. By September 6th, the Great Fire was effectively over. London had survived, but it was almost unrecognizable. The final destruction was staggering. Around 13,200 houses had been lost. 87 churches were destroyed. Much of the commercial center had disappeared. And yet, remarkably, the official death toll was surprisingly low compared with the enormous scale of the destruction. The physical damage, however, was immense. Thousands of people were homeless. Businesses had vanished. Financial records were gone. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. But the Great Fire had done something else. It had exposed a problem that could no longer be ignored. London could not simply be rebuilt in the same way. The old system had failed. And so, from the ashes, a different city began to emerge. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 introduced new rules designed to prevent another disaster on the same scale. Timber construction was restricted. Building materials were regulated. The dangerous overhanging structures that had helped the flames spread were removed. The city began moving toward wider streets, stronger buildings, and more organized urban planning. The Great Fire had destroyed the medieval heart of London. But it also forced the city to confront a lesson that would eventually shape urban design around the world. A city is not just a collection of buildings. It is a system. And when that system is designed without considering risk, one small failure can become a catastrophe. In 1666, the failure began with a spark, but the spark was never the real cause. The real cause was a city that had spent generations building the perfect conditions for fire. The timber, the density, the narrow streets, the political hesitation, the dry weather, the wind. All of them came together at exactly the wrong moment. And when they did, London did not simply catch fire. It burned itself from within. The Great Fire was therefore more than a disaster. It was a warning. And its legacy can still be seen today in the building codes, fire breaks, urban planning, and safety standards designed to ensure that modern cities never become another London of 1666.